What would you do if your boss yelled at you for being late? Only to find out you're the new CEO. Don Enrique would learn the hard way. Racism always has consequences. It was a rainy Monday, the kind of day that makes you question whether it's worth getting out of bed or if work can wait. Carla, in her elegant black dress and heels that made her stand out, knew she couldn't afford to be late. But the traffic in Bogota, even for a Monday morning, seemed like a bigger challenge than expected. As she peered out of the taxi, which had finally dropped her off at the office building, she quickly checked her watch. 5 minutes had passed beyond the start time. However, she didn't think much of it. She had always been punctual, and a few extra minutes here or there didn't seem like a big issue in the flow of the day. She entered the building, her heels echoing down the hall as her mind raced through the long list of tasks ahead. From improving internal processes to meetings with competing clients, which had become increasingly important. There was something about the air that Monday that made her feel like it would be a pivotal day for her, though she didn't know why. When she arrived in the meeting room, she saw the other employees already seated around the table. Among them was her boss, Don Enrique, a man in his 50s with an authoritative posture and an attitude shaped more by years of mistreating others than by any real merit. Carla was new to the company, but since her arrival, her ideas had been taken into account. She had heard rumors about how Don Enrique was known for his dismissive attitude, especially toward women and people of color. But Carla never imagined that she would be the target of such behavior. After all, she was a professional, and her skin color shouldn't have been a factor. But as soon as she entered the room, Don Enrique looked at her with disdain. "Carla, I've told you I don't like late arrivals," he shouted, glancing at his watch with disapproval. "Don't you know this is an important meeting? This is unacceptable." Carla, her face calm, couldn't help but feel a small annoyance. She didn't want to be spoken to in that manner, especially without reason. Although the fact that he had called her by her name and the way he did it confirmed her suspicions. Racism within the company was palpable, something she knew she had to face, but she preferred not to confront it just yet. She silently decided to sit down and focus on what was going to be a long day. But what no one knew was that Carla's arrival that morning wasn't a coincidence. The woman, who until then seemed like just another professional among the thousands working at the company, was the new CEO, a decision made in secret by the owners over the past few weeks. They had trusted her abilities and vision to transform the company into something bigger, more inclusive, and less controlled by the old hierarchical and oppressive ideas. Carla had been selected not only for her industry experience, but also for her ability to confront prejudices, like those held by Don Enrique. The meeting began, and the tension in the air was palpable. Don Enrique couldn't stop talking, displaying his posture with arrogance, as if he were in charge of everything. His words were always dismissive, especially toward the women in the room. But in the middle of his speech, Carla's voice firmly interrupted him. "Don Enrique, I'd like you to focus on the topic we're discussing," she said, looking directly at the man. He, however, didn't stop, and a grimace of annoyance appeared on his face. "Now you're going to teach me how to run the meeting?" he replied sarcastically. "If you're late, at least you should be more discreet." Carla, without losing her composure, looked at him intently. And then, for the first time, he noticed something different in her gaze. It wasn't the submissive look of the other employees. It was the look of someone who was there because she had the authority to be there. With a calmness that contrasted with his attitude, Carla responded, "Actually, Don Enrique, I'm not just an employee. I'm the new CEO of the company." Silence immediately filled the room. Don Enrique, who had never imagined that a woman, let alone a black woman, could reach such a high position, was left speechless. The other employees began looking at each other, stunned by what they had just heard. What are you saying?" he stammered, searching for a way to react. "This is a joke, right? You can't be." Carla, without raising her voice, showed him a copy of the contract she had signed with the owners, placing it on the table right in front of him. "What's happening, Don Enrique, is that the company has decided to take a new direction, one where everyone is valued for their ability, not their gender, race, or anything else unrelated to the work done here." Shame overtook the man, but he still tried to do what he always did when he was in trouble: play the power card. He attempted to smile, but his smile seemed forced. "Don't do this to me, Carla. We can talk, find a solution," he said with a trembling tone. Carla didn't flinch. She knew that the situation had changed forever. The fight for respect and equality began with a single gesture, and that gesture had arrived with her late arrival to the meeting. From that moment on, the days at the office grew more tense. Don Enrique, who had once felt untouchable, began to see his position crumble. His co-workers, who had feared his behavior, now observed more closely, realizing that the new CEO was not someone who would allow racism and discrimination to persist under her leadership. But what hurt Don Enrique the most was something he hadn't expected. One day, while he was in his office, his phone rang. It was a call from the very owners who had hired him years earlier. As he listened to their words, sweat began to bead on his forehead. The owners informed him that due to his attitudes and lack of leadership, especially his behavior toward Carla, they had decided to replace him. The news was an unexpected blow. The arrogance he had gained from believing he would never be questioned had led him to this point. The racism he had shown toward Carla had become his worst karma, and the woman he had despised was now his boss. The day Don Enrique received the call from the owners, the sense of dread that overtook him was indescribable. He hung up the phone, trembling. His mind couldn't process what he had just heard. In his head, the pieces didn't fit. He had been one of the pillars of the company for years. No one dared to question him, especially not a young woman who had only joined a few months ago, and even less so a black woman. But there it was. Reality had struck cruelly. The news spread quickly. Employees whispered in the hallways, some with relief, others in disbelief. No one expected such a swift decision to be made. But what no one knew, and what Don Enrique still struggled to accept, was that Carla's intervention had not just been a power adjustment. It had been, in many ways, the culmination of a long process of observation and resistance. Carla had studied every step of the company, every toxic attitude, every form of abuse of power. And, most importantly, she had seen what many were too afraid to admit: the deep-rooted racism in the halls. Don Enrique, for his part, spent the following days in a constant state of nervousness. When he wasn't checking emails or client calls that were now going directly to Carla, he was staring out of his office windows, watching as the walls of his world crumbled. People no longer respected him the way they once had. They didn't look at him with the same eyes. The small spark of his arrogance had completely vanished, and a deep sense of helplessness took hold of him. On a Monday morning, a week after the fateful meeting, Don Enrique arrived at his office, expecting a clearer response from the owners. However, upon arriving, he found an email in his inbox that froze his blood. Don Enrique, after a more thorough review, we have decided that it will not be necessary for you to continue with the company. The transition will take place in the coming days. Your severance will be processed as appropriate. He couldn't believe what he was reading. His professional life, which had revolved around this job for years, was crumbling before his eyes. It was as if someone had pressed a self-destruct button. Indignation, rage, and fear mixed explosively in his chest. In a fit of anger, he started shouting in his office, cursing everything and everyone. The company, Carla, life itself. But deep down, he knew the biggest enemy had been himself. Carla, on the other hand, continued with her work with remarkable calm. The decision to confront Don Enrique had not been easy, but she felt at peace. She knew she had acted correctly, and what surprised her most was the reaction of the other employees, who began to approach her more, not just because of her position, but because of the dignity she had shown. Everyone, without exception, respected her. But Carla wasn't one to celebrate the downfall of others. Her focus was always on the future, on progress. She understood that real change didn't just come from her decisions, but from the culture she was building within the company. However, karma kept lurking around Don Enrique, and his downfall was far from over. A couple of weeks later, a rumor started circulating around the office. Don Enrique had begun losing some of his most important contacts. Those same contacts with whom he had worked for years, those who had respected him for his authority and intimidating attitude. Now, those very clients who had once given him their full support were beginning to do business directly with the new CEO. Carla had managed to forge solid and trustworthy relationships with clients in just a few months, while Don Enrique's image was no longer viewed with the same admiration. It was clear that the company was changing, and not just from the top. Employees, motivated by the new atmosphere, began collaborating more with one another. Ideas flowed without fear of retaliation. As for Don Enrique, his attempts to retain power within the organization failed time and again. Desperately, he tried to contact the owners to present his version of events, but they no longer wanted to hear from him. His image was irreparably damaged. Even his closest colleagues began avoiding him, fearing being associated with someone already on the edge. But the worst was yet to come. One afternoon, Carla met with a small group of executives to discuss an important alliance with a foreign company that could take the company to a new level. While reviewing some financial reports, she received a phone call. At first, it seemed like any other call, but when she answered, something in a voice on the other end of the line sent a chill down her spine. It was Don Enrique. "Carla," he said, his voice cracked and almost inaudible. "I need your help. I'm losing everything, not just my job. My family has turned their back on me too." Carla didn't say anything for a few seconds. She knew what was happening. Don Enrique's fall wasn't just professional, it was personal. His racist attitude, abuse of power, and lack of empathy had left him completely alone. The people who had supported him in the past were no longer there. He had lost the trust of everyone, including his close friends. "Don Enrique," Carla responded firmly, "I'm sorry for what you're going through, but your karma has arrived. Everything you've done over the years has consequences, and I can't do anything to change that. The people who work here know that respect is earned through actions, not intimidation." She hung up without saying another word, but inside, she felt a mix of sadness and satisfaction. She knew her decision to confront him had been the first step toward the real change the company needed. However, she also knew that the damage Don Enrique had caused to so many people couldn't be erased overnight. From that moment on, the atmosphere in the company continued to change, and Carla, though aware of the great responsibility she now carried, never stopped working to ensure that a culture of respect, inclusion, and equity guided every decision within the company. Meanwhile, Don Enrique, now a shadow of what he once was trapped in the abyss of his own mistakes.